Hey, Ken, we're
We're live. I'm sorry, I missed that.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second panel in MEI's annual Countering Terrorism Conference. Our panel is entitled Countering Terrorism Since 9/11, International Perspectives. I'm Ken Delaney, an intelligence and national security correspondent for NBC News. 20 years after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, the threat from the likes of al-Qaeda and ISIS seems much diminished, but those groups and ideologies and the ideologies they represent have spread further than ever before. Meanwhile, far-right terrorism is on the rise. This panel will seek to assess the lessons learned from the so-called war on terror since 2001 from a range of international perspectives and to present alternative approaches to dealing with today's challenges. And to do that, we have a fantastic lineup of panelists who can apply the insights of the last 20 years to the challenges ahead. First, we have Nadwa Al-Dassari. Nadwa is a non-resident scholar at MEI with over 20 years of field experience in Yemen. She conducted extensive research in Yemen, providing deeper insights into the internal dynamics of the conflict in the country. Next, I'd like to introduce Ayman Dean. Ayman is the managing director of 5 Dimensions Consultants and a fellow at George Washington University's program on extremism. And of course, Ayman is famous for having spied on al-Qaeda for years. Hopefully he'll talk to us about that. And next we have Edmund Fitton Brown. Edmund is the coordinator of the ISIL al-Qaeda Taliban sanctions monitoring team at the United Nations. And he was the United Kingdom's ambassador to Yemen. And finally, I would like to welcome Jane Marriott. Jane is the UK's High Commissioner to Kenya, the former director of the UK Joint International Counterterrorism Unit, and also a former UK ambassador to Yemen. To submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. And for those calling in by phone or watching our panel on live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. And if you have any technical issues, please email that same address. And feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I'll be trying to look at your questions I'm on an iPad, so you might see my hand go up to press the Q&A button so that your questions can sort of help shape our discussion. So let me just start by saying, look, I have been an intelligence beat reporter for about 10 years. I do it for NBC. I did it for the LA Times and the Associated Press before that. And for a long time, that was essentially, you were a terrorism reporter if you were covering the American intelligence community. But in recent years, it struck me as I was preparing for this panel, I mean, I used to go to, cocktail receptions at the Pakistani embassy. I was in touch with the Yemenis. This was a front burner issue on the intelligence beat, and it's just not anymore. And yesterday, during William Burns' confirmation hearing to be the next CIA director, terrorism was barely mentioned. It was all about China and great power conflict. So I want to ask each of you why that is, and also want to sort of raise that by talking about just the numbers. I mean, I was looking at the Global Terrorism Index data, which shows that deaths from terrorism have declined in each of the last 5 years, and also impacts. And the number of deaths from ISIS terror attacks went below 1,000 for the first time, I guess, in 2019. So, have we won the war on terror, essentially? Jane Marriott, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much. I confess I'm not a huge fan of the term the war on terror or concepts of winning and losing, because there are always going to be individuals who want to cause terror from across the political and religious spectrum, and these will ebb and flow at different moments in history. So for me, the important thing is about perspective. At what point do you need to kind of put in your insurance policies? So effectively, you've got the networks, the intelligence ready to go as a threat rises, but to kind of not over focus on it. As you say, there's lots of other threats in the world. We all know the statistics that, I'm now trying to remember the exact one, more Americans are electrocuted in their bathtub each year than have died on average, with the horrendous exception, of course, of 2001. So it's a kind of, it's always going to be there, but let's keep it in perspective.
Edmund Fitton Brown, why don't you take a crack at that?
Well, I certainly share Jane's view on that. I think very important to keep it in perspective. I think one of the reasons we hear less about it now is that the threat level in non-conflict zones has gone down. We shouldn't forget, though, that conflict zones are still very, very troubled. Now, the issues in conflict zones are complicated. There are many of them. And of course, terrorism is only part of that picture. I think one of the most important questions we should ask ourselves is, given our concern about terrorism, is it necessary to have a global policy that addresses it? And there, I think the answer is definitely yes. I think the isolationist view that it's something that's happening over there and we can forget about it, I think that is a mistake. And I think what would happen if you do neglect the health of large swathes of the world is that sooner or later that threat will come back and hit you in the homeland.
That's an interesting point. We'll have to talk more about the impact of the Trump administration's go it alone policy on this whole picture. But give me your perspective on the relative successes in counterterrorism policy and where we are today in terms of the threat from terrorism.
Well, I could say that terrorism is like the weather. You can't control it. There are many factors billions of factors that could create the perfect storm sometimes. And so you would have period of calm, wonderful, lovely weather all around the world, and there is no activities. And then suddenly there is a storm brewing and you aren't aware of it until it hits you. And so this is exactly what happened with ISIS in the past, with al-Qaeda before in the 1990s. And so we are now going through where, a storm struck. Now we're going through some kind of a decent weather, and then there will be a time in the future, basically, where we are back to some turbulent weather. And we can't control the weather. We can't control, the factors that created this mess in the first place. The other issue is that I would say, considerable part of the success against groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS is due to the fact that they were their own worst enemies. So at the end of the day, they were the ones who were shooting themselves in the foot time after time after time after time, alienating people and not presenting themselves in the best light possible, to win more hearts and minds. So at the end of the day, they were more of an elitist. They had an elitist message. They were exclusionist. And as a result, they themselves made it easy, for themselves to diminish over time, not because, just because of the effort globally against them. And I won't call it a war because, a war is, very much different. And I agree with Jane on this. It's actually more of a, let's call it like a campaign, if we can call it this way.
And Nadwa, I want to dig into Yemen a lot in this panel discussion, so you don't have to get all this into one answer. But AQAP used to dominate the conversation in intelligence circles in the United States. It was a top tier threat, and you just don't hear much about them anymore. And the leader of the organization was captured. It barely made the news a few weeks ago. Talk about the situation right now in terms of terrorism in Yemen.
AQAP is still in Yemen. Having said that, as a Yemeni, I don't think AQAP is the greatest threat in Yemen right now. Right now, the current war that's happening, the grievances that are building up on top of the grievances that we had before are creating conditions for al-Qaeda to come back and other terrorist groups to emerge. And so I completely agree with Jane, Ayman, and Edmund that people here in the US in particular are very busy with the internal conflict here. America wanting to distance itself from problems in the Middle East and talking about the war on terror. If we want to measure it by the number of al-Qaeda leaders that were killed, yeah, there is some success. But then did we get out of the problem? No. And why do we always have to be reactionary? Why do we have to wait until a terrorist attack happened to react? I would say the problem still exists. There are conditions in Yemen that are now brewing, and they will offer excellent conditions for terrorist groups to come back and come back strong. And my worry is that if we don't address these problems right now, it will be a matter of time before they become a threat to the region and to the world. Yemen was more resilient in the past. And in my opinion, the Yemeni tribes have helped reduce al-Qaeda threat to a large extent. Having said that, the current conflict is undermining the resilience of the tribes in Yemen's social fabric, and also is creating, I mean, Ayman talked about, winning hearts and minds, and that was the past. In the past, people joined al-Qaeda because of, they won hearts and minds, but now the war is creating anger, resentment, and basically, perception of existential threat that al-Qaeda has taken advantage of and will take advantage of even more in the future.
Now I want to follow up, this goes a little beyond the scope of our discussion, but I just want to get your thoughts on, does the Biden administration decision to freeze support for the Saudi war, will that help the situation at all, or is that mostly symbolic?
Okay, look, I know one thing, that if airstrikes stopped in Yemen, the Houthi rebels will take Marib. Marib is a tribal area, but it's also a city that has grown massively over the past 4 years. It went from hosting 300,000, locals to like almost 3 million civilians from all across the country. It's a success story. And if Houthis push into Marib, they will destabilize the area. They will also capture oil facilities, which will give them resources to carry their war in other areas in Yemen, further stabilizing the country. So the decision to stop the Saudis, it's not that simple. Suspending arms sale to the Saudis is not going to end the conflict in Yemen. And in fact, as of right now, stopping airstrikes in Yemen will aid the Houthis, who are backed by Iran and who are a real threat to stability in Yemen and in the region.
Very interesting. Okay, pulling back the lens. Let me read you something that Tony Cordesman wrote in a report, a CSIS report in the fall about the big picture on terrorism. He said, the US has sometimes won major victories at a military level, but all of the foreign terrorist movements the US has targeted have survived or mutated into different organizations with different names. Worse, if one goes back to 9/11, none of the fundamental causes which keep extremist and terrorist movements alive and generate new threats have been reduced. Jane, do you agree with that?
So to some extent, yes, and I think it goes back to the earlier comments about, sort of terrorism evolves and it ebbs and flows, but terrorism always needs a sort of cause to latch onto. And I, as a sort of 16-year-old idealist, I believe that you could solve the problems of the world and stop causes for war. I'm afraid as a slightly older, still idealist, I think that even if you remove all of those fundamental causes today, there will still be grievances out there in the world, and there will still be terrorists latching onto those grievances and exploiting them for their own nefarious ends. So, address the fundamental causes, address the root causes. That's got to be a heart of tackling terrorism and preventing movements from coming up. But I think actually the next wave of terrorism that we will see as the decade progresses will be those people who fought together in Iraq and Syria, who sort of dispersed to the four corners of the globe right now, if you can have corners in a globe. And they're still in touch. They're organic, they're networked. They will find a way. Most will retire or get married and settle down. Some of them will be back, and some of them will form sort of the next wave. This is always going to be with us in some way, shape, or form. It's a matter of, as I say, keeping it in perspective, managing it, and tackling root causes where you can. There's a really interesting nexus as well about where you look at internal conflicts, external conflicts, what is insurgency, where does it tip into terrorism? So sometimes talking about something as terrorism or insurgency can actually be counterproductive because it overlooks the nuances that you need to tackle in order to get to those root causes in the first place.
Ayman, do you agree with that? And you were making the point that the Sunni-Shia conflict sort of eclipsed the desire of some of these extremist groups to target the West. How have these ideologies evolved in terms of willingness and desire to target the West?
Well, from 1996, from when Osama bin Laden returned to Afghanistan from Sudan, until 2011, when he was killed, and then they have the Arab Spring and all of that, anti-Americanism was the driving factor, the most important driving factor in radicalization and in driving terrorism in the Middle East and the Muslim world generally. But then the Arab Spring and the conflicts in Syria and Yemen in 2011 and then 2015 more or less shifted this into a sectarian, the sectarian factor being the more important one. The Sunni Shia divide right now in the Middle East is at its highest level in 1200 years. And this is without any exaggeration whatsoever. The level of bloodshed between the two sides, the level of hatred between the two sides is at its highest level in 1200 years, without doubt. So that, however, is the main cause of radicalization. So, and driving terrorism, so Zarqawi was one of those who started pushing it, when he started pushing the conflict from being anti-American to anti-Shia in Iraq. Then, of course, the rise of the Houthis in Yemen. Some might say, well, the Houthis are not Shia. No, they are actually. They are Zaydi Jarudis, and the Jarudis are different from the rest of the Zaydis of Yemen. Nadwa will correct me if I'm mistaken, but
right.
The Jarudis basically are closer to the strand of Imamat 12ers, Shia of Iran, and so therefore basically they do have more or less a close alliance with Iran religiously and in theology rather than just only in political alliance. So this is one of the reasons why when Mohammed bin Salman started the intervention, not the war was already happening in Yemen before that, but when he started the intervention to save the government of President Hadi in Aden, which was about to be overwhelmed. The Houthis were at the Anad airbase and they were about to storm Aden. His intervention somehow suddenly started the reverse of Saudi young people radicalization into ISIS. And that started to become more noticeable to the point where in May of 2015, which was 2 months after the intervention started, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, issued a statement, 28 minutes, in which he mentioned Saudi Arabia 34 times, in which he condemned Saudi Arabia and condemned its leaders because he started to see that the recruits from ISIS, recruits from Saudi Arabia into ISIS started to shrink because suddenly Mohammed bin Salman started to stand up against Iran. And it turns out that one of the motivators for Saudis to go and fight in Iraq is because of anti-Shia feelings among the Sunnis of the region, because they felt that Iran is expanding and no one is standing up to it. So when Mohammed bin Salman started the policy of standing up to Iran and putting an end, at least resisting its expansionist policy in Yemen, that had an effect on how many people were joining ISIS or al-Qaeda. That proved the point that anti-Americanism wasn't any longer the main driver in the conflict. It's actually shifted into sectarianism in the region, unfortunately. But I'm saying it's unfortunate whether it is anti-Americanism or anti-Shia or anti-Sunni on either side. It's unfortunate, but nonetheless, it has shifted. And this is exactly why the Saudis, by doing so in Yemen, have taken away the most important grievance that ISIS and al-Qaeda in Yemen were actually holding, which is no one is standing up to the Shia. We are the defenders of the Sunnis. But then Saudi Arabia came and started the intervention. That actually took away the prestige of al-Qaeda, reduced the recruitment and made them more and more irrelevant. Otherwise, if you take Saudi Arabia out of the equation, if you allow Iran basically to expand, then we go back into the bad old days of ISIS and al-Qaeda becoming the champions again, as Nadwa alluded to just minutes ago.
Edmund, let's get back to this question of root causes. I mean, I think Charles Lister made the point in the previous panel. We're talking about these words that no one likes to talk about: governance, development. I mean, what is the answer here in terms of addressing? The point Tony Gordon has been made. We haven't really addressed the grievances that caused terrorism in the first place. How does the developed world do that?
Well, I mean, of course, it needs to be about good governance, and it needs to be about countries functioning in the interest of their citizens. But I also want to mention among the root causes conflict. Conflict is an issue, and we mustn't lose sight of the conflict zones. And of course the conflict in Yemen is, as has just been said, is an issue here. One of the reasons why root causes and grievances matter is because there has to be, for terrorism to be focused, it has to have a rallying cry. And when we look at ISIL and al-Qaeda as organizations, neither of them is in particularly robust health at the moment. I mean, as Ayman just said, al-Qaeda has gone through real struggles in terms of retaining relevance in the face of ISIL's rise. But then ISIL itself has suffered a series of dramatic defeats and setbacks over the last few years, particularly in 2017 to 2019. And so it's not necessarily the case that either of these organizations is immensely powerful or immensely resilient. And that comes back to the point you made in the first introduction about, people being perhaps a little less concerned, asking, how much of a threat is this? But this is where I think the message is really potent. And the propaganda is important. It's very striking that ISIL, for example, when they were having to reduce their overall functionality in order to survive the military and counterterrorism onslaught that they were facing, how they never saw the issue of propaganda or of ideology as being something they could sacrifice, that was an essential function, something they could not live without under any circumstances. And of course, you can see the reason, because the thing that will then potentially mobilize a threat in the non-conflict zones in the future, it will be people's ability to rally around a banner. And ISIL are still putting this stuff out there. They're still emphasizing that they're flying the flag of resistance to whatever it is they're resisting. And that is still very powerful in terms of radicalizing people online.
That leads me to a question about tactics, because the Americans are very proud of their effort to tamp down through cyber means ISIS propaganda, to go after that operation and to reduce its scope. And so I want to ask about a broader question about Western counterterrorism tactics, and particularly drone strikes, targeted killings. Nadwa, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the Americans condemned the Israelis for doing it, and then after 9/11, we completely changed our minds about it, and it became a bipartisan consensus that this was okay to do. And by all accounts, it's been an incredibly powerful tool, including in Yemen. But what are your thoughts about the success of it, the impact of it, and other kinds of American and allied counterterrorism strategies?
Yeah, drone strikes have killed al-Qaeda leaders. There's no question about that. It has dismantled the group leadership in Yemen. However, drone strikes are problematic, not only because they killed a lot of civilians, but also because they interfered with the conflict dynamics. I remember in 2014, after the Houthis took over the capital city of Sana'a, and then they pushed into al-Bayda governorate. Al-Qaeda had presence there, but that's not why the Houthis advanced into that governorate. Now the local tribes, they didn't want the Houthis to come into their area, so they mobilized and they fought to stop the Houthis from incursion into their areas. What happened then was drone strikes killed tribal leaders, tribes members and tribal leaders who were fighting the Houthis to stop the Houthis' incursion into their areas, and inadvertently tipped the scale in favor of the Houthis and helped them take these areas. So that created an anti-American sentiment. And I go back to what Ayman said. It created an anti-American sentiment and a perception that America is in bed with the Houthis and Iran. And the perception is actually widespread in the region. And so if you look at Yemen, I wrote an article a few years ago, and the title of the article was "The Enemy of My Enemy is Al-Qaeda." 90% of the people who join Al-Qaeda in Yemen, they don't join Al-Qaeda because of ideology or because of anti-American sentiment, but because of grievances. I go back to the point of grievances. And so drones are not a very good tool to get rid of Al-Qaeda. One, because they create unintended consequences that defeats the purpose, right? But at the same time, they're not sustainable. You can't drone your way out of terrorism. you have to have a larger strategy. You have to address the not only the war, because the solutions that are proposed now to end the war in Yemen, in my opinion, they're going to be counterproductive, and they're going to make things worse in Yemen. But to actually address the grievances that made people pick up arms and fight, and in some instances join hands with terrorist groups to defend their homes.
I want everyone to address this, because actually, some of my CIA sources would say you absolutely can drone your way out of terrorism. I mean, obviously there other strategies are necessary, but drone strikes, targeted killing, they would say is essential and has transformed the threat picture. Obviously there's repercussions and blowback, but Jane, talk about your view of the success and the implications of the targeted killing in the war in the fight against terrorism.
So boringly, as an active UK diplomat, I'm going to tap out of this one and pass to the next person, I'm afraid.
I should have thought of that. Okay. Edmund, over to you, sir.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I also have to be a little careful on this subject. But I suppose the one thing I would say is that focusing on the term used, targeted killing, rather than drone strikes, because obviously targeted killing is something that happens by other means as well. Right. I think, and just as someone who is analyzing the threat and the evolution of the threat, there is a very active debate about how successfully you can degrade a terrorist group by killing its leaders. And I mean, there are plenty of examples where it has not worked, and where groups have proved to be perfectly resilient, perfectly capable of generating new leaderships, new people coming through to take over. It's certainly no panacea. That, I think, is definitely true. But just giving one example of the impact in Yemen that I recall from one of our monitoring team reports a couple of years ago, was when we were talking about the paranoia that had set in al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula because of the concerns about how they were being targeted. And so you ended up with sort of a deep fissure within the organization, with huge suspicion about people who were either spies or were careless with their use of their electronics or whatever it was. A whole range of things that sort of undermined the cohesiveness, the effectiveness of the group. So that was an interesting point. Can I just come back to one question you mentioned earlier, because it seems to segue quite well, and that was just about AQAP and why do we not hear so much about it now? And I think Nadwa made the point very, very, very well that the threat of al-Qaeda within Yemen remains very serious, and there's we should anticipate that this is a problem that we will have to deal with again in the future. But I think the reason, in answer to your question, why we hear less about it is because the threat is not currently projected outside Yemen. So we come back to that point about people being comfortable if they don't think something's going to interfere with their everyday lives. And particularly with AQAP, as you know, the big thing that people were concerned about was the threat to civil aviation. And there was a time when that was the big news in counterterrorism. It was the question of whether another aeroplane would be attacked. And AQAP was regarded as being the key source of that threat. But then AQAP went into a relative operational decline. And indeed, of course, their chief bomb maker, Asiri, was killed. And I think that does help to explain why you hear less about AQAP these days.
And I'm in the counterterrorism officials in the US would say that's because of targeted killing. So again, I want to stay on this because the technology is only becoming more sophisticated. We're already seeing sort of like non-explosive weaponry that can kill one person in a car and not kill the passenger. There's going to be a point in time where a drone the size of a toy helicopter can fly in and assassinate someone. It's only going to be easier for leaders to order those kinds of operations. And so I'd like you to assess, the effectiveness, the impact, the blowback, all of that.
Well, when it all started, of course, I mean, the collateral damage was, too great to swallow. But then as we started advancing forward, I mean, we started to see more and more sophisticated technology involved. I mean, where you see spies on the ground placing tracker beams and tracker devices on the exact individual in a targeted car. And so you don't end up in a situation where, like what happened in Afghanistan, tribal leaders telling on each other so they can get rid of each other by saying to the Americans, hey, there is a Taliban meeting, when in fact it's a wedding involving basically a rival tribal leader. And so we moved away from that. We have now reached a sophistication where rotator blades, can basically just be dropped from a drone, and that's exactly what happened to Abu al-Faraj al-Masri in Idlib in Syria. Also, what happened to Abu al-Khair al-Masri, Ibrahim Siyasa, as we used to know him in al-Qaeda. So he also was killed this way. It's just the rotator blade. It's a Hellfire missile, but it's without explosive head. It's just a rotator blade. It's more like they call it the samurai sword. Basically, like it just drops into the car, and you end up basically with a mincemeat inside the car. But the reality is, no one else, would be harmed, hopefully. So, and that I think, is where technology started to solve the problem of collateral damage, and we are no longer basically trigger happy. At least I don't see more trigger happy use, of this, this method anymore. I mean, I was in the past basically involved in providing information which led to a targeted killing, although not in a drone. And that of course basically always weighs on someone's conscience. I mean, what are you doing here? I mean, what is it for the greater good or not? But then, of course, it led to the killing of one of al-Qaeda leaders in the Arabian Peninsula. But what does it mean in the end is that a victory can only achieve by exhausting the other side. Seriously, it's all about exhaustion. Who gets exhausted first? And the continuous liquidation of leaders, end up in the production of less capable and leaders after that, to the point where that's it. You reach a threshold where it will take them years and years and years to come up with a new generation of good, capable leaders. So I'm afraid I might disappoint many by saying that there is a merit, to targeted killing, because it does exhaust that supply of leadership who are capable and who could basically inflict more damage on us, around the world, and it could actually who could recruit more and more people and damage more lives. Sometimes you are in this moral dilemma where you have to end a life that could end other lives if you let it live.
Got it. And I should point out that there was not much targeted about the killing that occurred by the U.S. military in Syria and Iraq, and ousting ISIS from its physical caliphate. That was a pretty conventional bombing operation. I feel like we still don't know all the implications and impact and what happened there, because eyes were elsewhere during the Trump administration. But Jane, one thing I read in preparing for this is that ISIS has metastasized and spread throughout Africa, and I wondered if you could give us your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two angles here. One is diaspora sort of alumni, as it were, who graduated from Syria and Iraq, who have come back to their hometowns. Now, there's a lot of fuss about this in 2014, 2015, the foreign fighter problem. Everyone was going to sort of return across the globe and sort of stop blowing everyone up in situ, and that hasn't happened. But I think it's premature to think that a small variation of that won't happen. So what we have seen, it goes back to my earlier point about the future wave of terrorism, will be sort of organic and networked, because it's people who have been in Iraq and Syria, who have come back either to the continent, to Africa, across the globe, to Asia. There's lots of sort of countries out there that are good tourism destinations that have had a decent number of foreign fighters, and most of them will just settle back into a new life that doesn't involve terrorism. But there will be a minority who attach themselves to local insurgencies and local movements that want to ally to a higher cause and higher purpose because it's better publicity for them. And you see a bit of that in Mozambique, for example, with the groups around Cabo Delgado, where they're affiliating themselves to Islamic State, partly for profile, because if suddenly if you're Islamic State, you're going to get better media headlines, and I'll talk about you on a video like this, rather than if you're a local insurgency that is just doing some bad stuff to local people. That's where you get to local root causes. And some of this for me also comes back to, as we was talking about root causes, those fundamentals about provision of rule of law, democracy, accountability, human rights. Having all of these things doesn't mean you're immune from terrorism. There have been enough terrorist attacks in countries like that. There's been some homegrown radicalized terrorists in good solid democracies, but at least there you have more outlets for grievances. And I think in some countries across the globe where we're not seeing rule of law in a way that people want it, the people themselves want it, you're not seeing accountability, you're seeing local corruption, that's feeding into those local grievances and feeding into the ability of groups or individuals or small groups who fought in Iraq and Syria to latch onto those local grievances and form a new wave. Perhaps sounds a bit grand, but new ink spots that could become something of a wave.
And now to back to the threats emanating from Yemen. Is it possible that if another bomb maker comes along who figures out a new way to plant bombs on airplanes or some other terrorism strategy, that Yemen becomes yet again a center for international terrorist threats aimed at the West? What are the prospects of that?
It's actually pretty frustrating to me that we are looking only at Sunni extremist groups. And it's true, al-Qaeda is mainly Sunni extremist groups, same with ISIS. But at the same time, in Yemen, we have a group, the Houthis, who are extremists. They're the Salafi version of Shia, and I agree, they're Shia. They're not really Zaydis, and they have imported the system of extreme repression from Iran that they're using to suppress Yemenis. But at the same time, this is a group that's driven by ideology more than anything else. Their slogan is death to America, and they've been systematically mass indoctrinating children in schools and other public venues and private venues, creating an anti-American sentiment that have not existed before. So I'm not a big fan of designations, and I was against designating the Houthis, but I think it's important to keep an eye on that threat, not only the Sunni groups, but also at the same time, looking at Sunni extremists, al-Qaeda and otherwise. Houthis' expansion into tribal territories create conditions for al-Qaeda and extremist groups to operate, because Houthis' expansion, this is a group that's driven by ideology, a Shia ideology. They claim a divine right to rule. They rule with extreme suppression, which is strange to Yemen. Even President Saleh regime was not that suppressive. And so the reaction is deep resentment against this group. And if people lose hope to defend themselves, they'll turn over to any group to help them. And they might, al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda in particular, it offers really good fighting tactics. They have done that in al-Bayda in Yemen. And so it creates anti-American sentiment. It's ideologically motivated, but at the same time, Houthis' expansion by force across Yemen is also creating conditions for al-Qaeda to find more pockets and more places to recruit people who are, disadvantaged from this expansion.
We actually had a question from the audience about the Houthi terrorism designation issue. So why are you opposed to that? And based on what you said, do you fear that the Houthis could eventually decide to start attacking targets outside their country?
They have attacked ships in the Red Sea. They have attacked Saudi Arabia. They have attacked Aramco. It's in their DNA.
Of course, yeah.
And I think it's only right now they're busy wanting to defeat Saudi Arabia and other actors in Yemen. But it will only be a matter of time before they start posing a threat to the rest of the world, in my opinion. I was against the designation, and I'm happy it was lifted, not because I think Houthis are not terrorists, I think they are, but because of the unintended consequences. the designation will have come at a really high price to ordinary Yemenis at probably no cost to the Houthis. I mean, the Houthis have created all this network of, black market and informal economy where you cannot really track who's running these networks. So it's because of that I think I was against the designation. At the same time, they have the upper hand militarily, and they hold 70% of the population hostage in their area. So how can you designate a group that have that much power, and control?
Edmund, I want to turn to the question of multilateralism and partnerships and how important that is to counterterrorism. Many of you in your comments, pre-panel comments, talked about that, and I wondered how that's been going through the Trump administration, which was America first, go it alone. But was it the case that behind the scenes, actually, those counterterrorism partnerships were still robust, and that even though Trump was doing his thing, the CIA and other agencies were cooperating closely with allies? And give me your assessment of multilateral cooperation on counterterrorism, what lessons we've learned in that sphere since 9/11.
Sure. I mean, I make no comment on individual national policies. I think we can talk in broad trends, and I think that the multilateral cooperation on counterterrorism has dramatically increased over the last 20 years. And of course, it's certainly true that 9/11 was a big driver for that. But my own committee, 1267 committee in the United Nations, goes back to 1998. 1999, after the attack on the US embassies in East Africa. So that side of things, the UN aspect of it, UN sanctions and various types of UN-driven cooperation has been evolving throughout that 20-year period and has become increasingly mature. I also observed that the operational level cooperation between counterterrorism agencies has just grown more and more sophisticated, more and more determined, I think, over that period. It remains the case, of course, that there will always be barriers to member states talking to each other on sensitive matters, and that may sometimes be because of political rivalries, or it may sometimes simply be because of habits of secrecy, which may have their place, but may also inhibit forms of cooperation as well. So you get into there's a phrase people used to talk about, the dare to share. You have to dare to share information, because otherwise you won't be able to respond effectively to it. And I've watched that happen over the 20 years, and I would say that we're in a better place now than we were. And I think one of the most important changes that has come about, and I think the UN has had a significant positive role in this, has been in people insisting on building certain safeguards into cooperation as well. You don't simply say, it's the international community against the bad guys, and the bad guys have to be dealt with by whatever means. You also have to think about the moral health and also the long-term viability of your international effort, and it has to be ethically and legally compliant. And one of the things that I've been particularly impressed by in the time that I've been working within the broader UN CT community is how much of the UN work on counterterrorism capacity building and helping member states to meet the threat that they face has hardwired into it a whole series of rule of law, human rights, humanitarian and other compliance aspects. And that will actually be immensely helpful to member states in the longer term, because it means that those issues then are less of an inhibitor to cooperation on the ground.
Amen. Rule of law, human rights, humanitarian, these are not terms that one commonly has associated with the Trump administration. Maybe you can be more free to talk about what were the implications of what happened on CT cooperation during the Trump years. It's surprising to me, actually, that the Trump administration didn't make more hay about the sort of diminishment of the risk of terrorism throughout their time. I mean, he certainly talked a lot about defeating the caliphate, but what happened while Trump was pursuing his America First, go it alone policy? What happened to CT cooperation?
If you talk to many people who are working in intelligence agencies, whether it's in Europe or the Middle East, they will tell you, there wasn't that much different situation, because the relationship they established with their counterparts in the US and Canada and Australia and elsewhere. Basically, it predates Trump by 2 decades, and so therefore, the arrival of Trump and the policies he implemented had a minimal impact on the cooperation. I will go as far as I'm saying basically that Trump more or less, by focusing on the caliphate, he did actually have an impact on eradicating it as a physical force in Iraq and Syria, and that was because one, the circumstances were right, two, because of the Russian intervention in Syria in 2015, and as well as many other factors, but also the fact that he did allow, to some extent, he did allow the the forces within the Middle East, especially the forces of local governments, basically, to do what was necessary in order to eradicate that problem from within their territories. So, in a sense, the fact that there was no new conflict, the fact that there was no major US involvement in any particular conflict there, was in itself a blessing. The fact that the Arab world was going through a fatigue from the Arab Spring, or the so-called Arab Spring, also helped. That the populations were tired of ideologies, that helped. So in essence, Trump did not have that much of either a negative or a positive impact on the war on terrorism, if you can call it this way. It just continued, as it was before. But let me put it this way: his time was less brutal than Obama's or Bush. And that in itself, is weird anomaly, but people would associate, more negativity with his era, but his era wasn't as brutal or as bloody as, the Obama's era, for example.
Unless you happen to live in Raqqa, of course, but
yeah, of course, that's, I'm talking about one exception was ISIS caliphate.
But you make a really interesting point. Is it possible that Trump's, sort of stated policy of bringing American troops home and, getting out of the Middle East had a positive effect on the terrorism picture, reduce the sense of grievance?
Actually, what he did in standing up against Iran was what calmed Sunni fears down. And more or less, that, again, I keep repeating this, it's no longer anti-Americanism, the first and the most important driver of radicalization. It is the fear of Iran. Basically what happened is the fact that the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco would sign, a normalization treaties with Israel. And I don't see that much opposition to it within the Saudi Twitter sphere, is something we can only dream of 3 years ago. And the reason for that, when I talk, and I'm from Saudi Arabia, I talk to my family, I talk to my people, I talk to my friends. Why is that? And they say, well, look, Israel is a country of 6 million people and no one think they will ever invade us. But Iran is a country of 86 million people and they are trying to brainwash the 46 other million Shia in the region, and they want to basically use them in order to invade us and control us. I would rather put my eggs in the basket of Netanyahu and Trump than trusting in the possible goodwill hiding behind the cloak of taqiyya from the Ayatollahs of Iran. That is the problem here, sectarianism. And so what happened is the fact that the Saudis and the Emiratis, with the backing of Trump, did actually push back, and even the Israelis push back, against Iran's aggressive expansionism in Syria and Yemen. That pushback was important to decrease the level of radicalization among the Sunnis, because the more aggression from Iran you have, the more and it's not checked by any global or regional power, the more radicalization you will have among Sunnis. And that could actually rebound on everyone globally. And this is exactly what Nadwa has been saying too.
Yeah, let's talk about, to Nadwa's point, let's talk about Iran and where Iran fits into the overall terrorism picture. Jane, what kind of international terrorism threat has Iran posed over the last many years, and does it pose now?
So I think one of the interesting elements of this has been sort of the history of Iran allowing al-Qaeda in a constrained form to be physically present on its territory. Now, this is not Iran is secretly backing al-Qaeda point, because they're not, but Iran has got its own reasons for having allowed over the years leading members of al-Qaeda on its territory. But Iran ultimately will act in its own nationalist interest, and it's got a very sophisticated calculation of what that looks like, whether it is allowing sort of senior members of al-Qaeda in some sort of limited form of house arrest or elsewhere to be on its territory, or whether it's cooperating with what you could arguably call terrorist groups throughout the region. I did at some point want to talk about right-wing terrorism, but I think you've got a bit more of Iran discussions from others as well before we get on to that.
Oh, I was wondering whether anyone wanted to talk about that. I'm very open to talking about that. Yeah, but let's just do, anyone else want to answer about Iran before we move on to right-wing terrorism? Okay, Ayman, go ahead.
Okay, just a quick one. I remember I met with a senior in 2014 in Beijing, of all places. I met with a senior Iraqi national security advisor, and he is in touch with, or he was in touch with Ali Akbar Wilayati, who is the the foreign affairs advisor of the Ayatollah Khamenei, but also he used to be the foreign minister of Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. And he asked him the question, you're allowing al-Qaeda people to be in your territory. Why? He said, well, we give them phones, and we give them assistance, we give them even finances, but their phones can only dial only two international codes, 00966 and 00973, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. That's it. And I was at that time, before that, in 2002, 3, 4, I was in Bahrain, being in the middle between Hamza Rabi', who was the head of al-Qaeda's operations globally, and he was based where? In Chabahar, in Iran, with the full knowledge of the IRGC and the Quds Force. And they were sending money and instructions to my associates, Yusuf al-Ayari, Khalid al-Hajj, Abdul Aziz al-Nigran, who were the leaders of al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia. The money used to come from there, and the instructions used to come from there. And of course, I passed that entire knowledge basically to the British government at that time. So the knowledge that Iran was involved, and complicit in orchestrating attacks in Saudi Arabia that killed British and American, individuals in Saudi Arabia, and in my hometown, Al Khubar, in the Sana compound, was it was absolutely provable.
Okay, Nadwa, did you want to say anything about Iran before we move on?
So I don't want to say about Iran. I want to say about the Houthis, building on the same point that Ayman mentioned, Iran hosting terrorist leaders to orchestrate terrorist attacks. And this is another thing in Yemen that people have to pay attention to, that extremist groups are also part of, part and parcel of the Yemeni political bargain. Former President Saleh has used the Houthi, the Al-Qaeda in the past to keep the counterterrorism money flowing from the West. He cooperated with terrorists. He kept their threat alive enough to make money from the West and to keep that international legitimacy. And Houthis are doing the same thing. There are, in fact, in a report by the UN Analytical Support and Sanction Monitoring Team concerning ISIS and Al-Qaeda that Edmund is part of, the report in 2020 mentioned that the Houthis have provided tactical help, cooperation, prisoner exchanges, and handover of military camps to ISIL in Baida province in Yemen. So the Houthis have also orchestrated, manufactured terrorist attacks. And in my opinion, they, according to my local contacts, ISIS in Bayda, their main supporters are, are the Houthis. And the reason is, and a lot of people think that, oh, well, if Houthis are Shia, then they're automatically anti-terrorist, Sunni extremist groups, but it doesn't work that way. In fact, political actors in Yemen have employed terrorist groups, and Houthis, like Houthis are doing the same now. So the reason is, one, for Houthis to present themselves as an alternative in the war on terror. So with that, they build international legitimacy, but at the same time, they use them to undermine their opponents. And most of the people who were killed by ISIS in Yemen are army, Yemeni government army, soldiers and tribal leaders who fought the Houthis. So I think that's also an important thing to keep in mind, that just because Iran is Shia, just because Houthis are Shia, it doesn't mean that they are the enemy of extremist groups, al-Qaeda or ISIS or otherwise.
That is a great example of how complicated this subject is. Jane, obviously far-right terrorism is the front burner terrorism issue in the United States. And when I've talked to folks in the UK, they say where they designate terrorist organizations, right-wing terrorist organizations, unlike what we can do in the US, they say that all their cases over there have a nexus to the United States because there's so much extremism, First Amendment protected, spewing out of the United States. Well, talk about your assessment of where things are going on in that sphere.
So I'm going to wheel sort of the history clock back about 5 years, when I'd just taken up my post as then International Counter-Terrorism Director in the UK. And this was height of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Everyone's very much focused on those movements, and we were reviewing our contest, the UK's counter-terrorism strategy. And we got to get together a bunch of sort of think tankers and academics and experts, and we talked about this, but particularly about ISIS, for 2 or 3 hours. And we got to the end of it, and I said, when we look back at the next version of contest in 5 years' time, in 2020, what's the thing that we're going to have got wrong? And they all immediately turned around, having not mentioned it in the last 3 hours, they all immediately turned around and went, right-wing terrorism. You're going to have missed right-wing terrorism. So as a result of them raising it, we didn't miss it. And of course, there's sort of lots of experts in the system who would have picked this up as well. But it's certainly something that's been on the UK radar for some time. And even back in sort of 2015, 2016, as part of our PREVENT programme, as our prevention of radicalisation programme, which is a social response to people potentially going into terrorism, not a criminal one. A significant number, and it is now a third of those cases, were linked to right-wing terrorism. And then we were having conversations with officials within the US administration in that sort of 2016, 2020 period. And I think there was quite a lot of internal frustration from people within the American system who recognised that right-wing terrorism and polarization, the right wing doesn't have sort of exclusive purview over extremist movements, that this was really a problem, but that the US, A, wasn't able to look at it, and B, society was heading in quite a polarized direction. So we are in a situation where we get to 2021, where we've gone from it not really being something talked about 5 years ago, although right-wing terrorism has been with us in its multiple forms for decades, to where we are sort of seeing a consistent pattern of attacks globally, not just in the US, against synagogues, against mosques, whether we're talking about Christchurch, Finsbury Mosque in the UK, those institutions in the US, but for me, again, it goes back to the very first point that we made in this conversation around root causes. What are the root causes of a lot of right-wing terrorism? A lot of it is about polarization, disconnect from society, looking for a higher purpose in life, wanting to be part of a club. Exactly the same things that radicalize sort of Islamist extremists are the same sorts of themes, but with a different religious or a religious hat on, that are radicalizing on the far right as well. So, this does need to be the focus for the next sort of 5 to 10 years, whilst not taking our eyes off all the other potential threats as well.
Yeah, and I can tell you the top issue right now in the US intelligence community is grappling with how American intelligence agencies, what role can they play in collecting on this threat, given the First Amendment concerns. But that's beyond the scope of our discussion here. I think it's time to start looking at audience questions. And here's a good one, because we haven't really talked about Afghanistan. So Edmund, for you, a question: why wasn't the Taliban ever put on the U.S. State Department's foreign terrorist organizations list? And really, I think Charles made this point in the previous panel. You know, that al-Qaeda works closely with the Taliban. We kill al-Qaeda, but we negotiate with the Taliban. How does that work?
Well, I mean, first of all, I can't answer for State Department or for U.S. government. In terms of the UN, the designations under the 1988 committee are of individuals, Taliban individuals, and of course a lot of them are designated under the UN, and that has global significance. It has global force. So there is definitely a very strong sanctions disincentive operating for the Taliban. We know the Taliban are very anxious to be free of UN sanctions, so there's some effect there. In terms of Taliban and al-Qaeda, I mean, you know, I don't want to get into a history lesson because that could go on too long, but you'll know that the UN sanctions regime began affecting both of them, and was only really separated out in 2011 to have one committee dealing with al-Qaeda and the other one dealing with the Taliban. The thinking there, of course, is to do with the likely need for the Taliban or for Taliban individuals to have a role in a future peace process in Afghanistan. And of course, that was envisaged in 2011. It became something very much more of a reality last year. Now in 2021, we're in a very interesting situation where, you know, there is a peace process underway. The question is, you know, how successful is that peace process going to be? And one of the key indicators of whether the Taliban is a serious partner for peace or not will be whether the Taliban shows that it is serious about suppressing any possible international terrorist threat from Afghanistan and breaking off its own relations with al-Qaeda, which remain close.
Yeah, and speaking of that, as you know, because you were quoted in it, and we did a story recently about this, and we quoted former CIA officer Doug London, who worked this issue at the agency, who said, basically, there's so much intermarriage between al-Qaeda and the Taliban that it's not realistic to you're never going to break this up, this relationship. He said, even if Taliban leaders want to turn the page on al-Qaeda, and my experience suggests that they don't, it would be a practical impossibility to expect Taliban fighters to abandon daughters, grandchildren, and son-in-laws. I mean, what's your view about whether the Taliban can ever fully break with al-Qaeda?
Well, I mean, Doug is right about the organic link. I mean, and we reported on that also, that they are organically linked. And we know that there are discussions taking place about, well, what is somebody's nationality? You know, are they a foreigner? Are they an Afghan? You know, how long have they been in the country? And so there are complexities around this. I think that at least in broad terms, there's a need for the Taliban to demonstrate that they are serious about Afghanistan's responsibilities and about their responsibilities in contributing to a peaceful Afghanistan. So, you know, I think you could always quibble with the detail on this, but I think we'll know whether there are signs of the Taliban being serious about suppressing any potential future threat to the international community from al-Qaeda or not. And as yet, we haven't seen any evidence that they are.
And I mean, to address that question, and also, what happens if the U.S. does pull out of Afghanistan? I mean, will there be a resurgence of terrorism there?
I think while you can't separate al-Qaeda and Taliban on the organic level, but you can separate al-Qaeda and Afghanistan on the organic level, if you see what I mean. And the idea is that the Taliban can easily say to al-Qaeda, well, you have already other bases, especially in Syria and in Yemen. Therefore, you could basically relocate, you know, your operations there. But if you are going to live in Afghanistan, you live as, you know, guests who are seeking asylum. You know, that is the best possible way in order to have a peaceful Afghanistan in the future. This could happen, but only if Hibatullah Akhundzada would ask it of Ayman al-Zawahiri, and Ayman al-Zawahiri would, swear to him that that's it, no longer we will use Afghanistan as a base of operations. That is easier said than done, because Bin Laden, told Muhammad Umar in 1998, I didn't do the East Africa bombings. I had nothing to do with it. They did a court. He denied his responsibility, and they believed him. I mean, and because of the old Hanafi laws, implemented there, and because of the old code of honor that is there in Afghanistan, which I admire very much, meant that someone who sought asylum with us cannot be handed over accusations that cannot be proven. So, however, the Afghanistan of today is not the Afghanistan of the 1990s, and al-Qaeda or any other group basically will find it extremely difficult to operate as they operated in the 1990s. And I saw basically that there is significant movement of people, including leaders from Afghanistan all the way to the Levant. I mean, I remember Abdul Hadi al-Iraqi was moving there before he was caught in Turkey. As I said, Abu Faraj al-Masri went there. Ibrahim Siyasa or Ibrahim Abu Khair also went there. And as well as the fact that many of the leaders are in Iran rather than in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan seems to be devoid of leaders, except Ayman al-Zawahiri and Abu Abdurrahman al-Maghribi and others, and that's it. And so therefore we are in a situation where we could see a divorce, not between al-Qaeda and the Taliban, but between al-Qaeda and Afghanistan, in an operational way. And only those leaders who have nowhere else to go because they are well known would remain there, being, guests, hoping that, the kind hand of death in natural causes will take them away. I mean, that is because, Zawahiri is 69 and he's not that long for the world. So that's, I think, what the Taliban basically are hoping for. But the Taliban, knowing the Taliban before, they never ever had any ambitions outside of Afghanistan. Outside of the borders of Afghanistan, they never had any ambition or any desire basically to harm any other nation. And that was what I always felt about them, knowing them. But of course, al-Qaeda abused that code of honor that the Taliban basically had, and went ahead to commit these atrocities.
Okay, so here's another question from the audience, pulling back the lens a little bit. As mentioned in the beginning of the panel, deaths caused by terrorism have dropped significantly in recent years. With this, terrorist attacks by lone actors or inspired actors without organizational support have sort of been on the upswing. And that's more in the Western context. But Jane, I mean, the question is, what should the U.S. and international partners be doing to combat the disinformation, the radicalization of non-state actors?
So, question of disinformation, misinformation is obviously something that goes much further beyond terrorism, and I think it is the defining question of our era. And it's an era where, we used to be able to turn on the TV and we'd see, the established news channels, and you could rely on them as experts. And frankly, I still think you can. But an awful lot of people will come up with theories why they're all part of some grand conspiracy and not telling the truth. And the counterterrorism world, the terrorism world, is no different. And one of the things that we've seen with a lot of radicalization on the Islamist side is that false views of Islam are being fed into to radicalize people. And when you actually sort of sit them down with a copy of the Quran and sort of walk people through, that's not the Quran is not actually their understanding of Islam. So, disinformation, misinformation is as age old as warfare. But I think in the electronic age, it is about teaching critical thinking. It's about teaching people not to accept the bit that's superficially fed into their brains. It's about teaching people to sense check. And a lot of this, its grassroots cause is our education systems. And that's something we very much need to focus on as part of the longer term solutions for misinformation more broadly. Just on the sort of the lone attacker, again, sort of going back a couple of years with anecdotes, there was a lot of media reporting calling these people lone wolves, which made them sound very sexy. And so there was a real sort of push to say, look, can you call them what these people are, which is sort of misinformed loners, often sat in their own bedroom, radicalizing themselves online. And that is where perhaps if you can get to those people, if their friends worry about those people, they're the sorts of people typically that get reported to our Prevent hotline in the UK, where family members are worried about changes of behaviours in individuals because they've sort of read this misinformation and are going down the wrong path. So a lot of it starts at home. Tackling terrorism starts at home, and loving your loved one enough to worry about their behaviour and talking to somebody about it.
Nadwa, the Yemeni American cleric Anwar al-Awlaki is perhaps the single biggest inspiration for some of these lone actors who took action in the West and the United States, and is still, as far as I can tell, having an impact in some circles. Is there anybody else on the horizon in Yemen or elsewhere that you know of who has that kind of influence?
Not that I can think of. And again, people attack sometimes, like Jane said, not because of ideology is a tool for them to like express a certain grievance. So I think that's what people need to look at. In terms of Yemen, I don't think anybody has surfaced as a, charismatic leader like Anwar al-Awlaki and others.
Is it? Throw this out to anybody. I mean, is the ideology of some of these groups, does it have the same appeal that it once did? I mean, based on recent events and what happened with ISIS. I mean, talk about the evolution of the ideology and whether it's still appealing to young people and causing radicalization. Whoever wants to take it.
I think Ayman can answer that, but I'm going to say that in the case of Yemen, like I said, 90% of the people who joined al-Qaeda since, the beginning of time, did because of grievances, not ideology, especially more, during the war as well.
Ayman, go ahead.
Well, in order to understand why we are where we are, we have to understand that, the root cause of the whole thing from the beginning. What we have right now in the world when it comes to Islam, whether Sunni or Shia Islam, is not a war between Islam and the West or between Islam and the rest of the world. It is a civil war within Islam. It's been going on and raging for almost 7-8 decades now. It is basically between, on one side, the modern nation state, and on the other side, the factions that want to bring down the modern nation state. There are 3 factions that want to bring down the modern nation state because they don't believe in it whatsoever. So you have political Sunni Islam, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. You have the Sunni militant Islam, which is ISIS, al-Qaeda, Hamas, whatever you want to call it, the Shabab. And then you have the political and the militant Shia Islam under the system of Walat al-Faqih, which is Tehran and their allies, which is Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias, and those who revolve around them. Now, these 3 factions are united in their hatred of the modern nation state, in their disbelief in the modern nation state, in the fact that the modern nation state is the barrier against their dream of, each one of them, the messianic eschatological dream of establishing, the kingdom of the fairy tale called the Mahdi, whether the Mahdi of the Sunni or the Mahdi of the Shia, which is a lie, from history perpetuated by, the Abbasids. Then it took a life of its own and seeped into the imagination of the Shia and the Sunnis, unfortunately. So you end up in a situation where 3 factions are trying to, undermine the modern nation state for the sake of a fairy tale. And we are in this conflict right now because of this, because of what do we want, as people. And this is when and the tragedy that's even befell my own family, where I had a cousin, a 20-year-old, and a nephew, 19-year-old, going to Syria and get killed there just for this vigil. So when you talk with them, when you talk to these young people, and ask, what is it that you want? And people say, I want a khilafah. I want, to pave the way for the Mahdi. We are about the epic battles of the, end of time. We have to be ready. And when you try to tell them basically that, most of what you actually were fed is, either, a downright lie or actually, weak in its foundations to the point that it doesn't have any basis in truth. And if you talk about it to people like this, and they say, you tell them that you are supposed to take a step back from all of this and examine the fact that we are in a civil war where the majority of the victims are fellow Muslims, and it's all about the visions of leaders who are manipulating this for their own good and for their own ambitions. Only then we will have some resolution. Only when we defend the nation state as the objective that needs to be defended. The nation state is the only model that can guarantee security, stability, safety, law and order, and, and prosperity for the future, for our future generation. We can't do that if we continue to tiptoe around the fact that we don't challenge the eschatological messianic vision of all of these actors who want to undermine the nation state. Defend the nation state, we get somewhere. We don't defend the nation state, then we're going nowhere. And unfortunately, we have alliance between those groups and those on the left in Europe and America who want to undermine the nation state even in these spheres in order to achieve their own goals. At the end of the day, the nation state is the only guarantor of peace, security, stability, and law and order.
We're getting close to the end, so I want to ask a kind of baseline question. This panel is about perspectives over the last 20 years. So let me start with you, Edmund. What is the individual nation states or the international community, however you want to answer it? What have they done wrong in the struggle against terrorism over the last 20 years? The biggest things that come to mind, and what have they done right?
Well, I think on what they've done right, I kind of already said about what I considered to be the dramatic improvement in international cooperation, and I think that's needed for the future. On the wrong side, I mean, slightly controversial thing to say as someone in the sort of CT industry, as it were, but I think we overreacted after 9/11. I think there were times when people behaved as if terrorism was the biggest strategic threat out there, and it never was. And that was when it was at its height. And it's clearly less now than it was then, at least as a clear and present threat in most of the world. And of course, the risk there is that if you divert huge amounts of resource onto one threat, then you may be neglecting other threats, and we could all name a whole series of them, including big picture things like the environment, climate change, but also even more common or garden geostrategic threats, which really matter. So I think that if there was a mistake, I think it was getting to the point where it was as if we couldn't tolerate any level of terrorist threat. I think the reality is that I think as Jane said earlier, there always will be some threat. There are threats of all kinds. If somebody said, I'm going to eradicate all road accidents, you'd think they were crazy. And yet people do occasionally say that we have zero tolerance for terrorism. There will always be some terrorism. So the overreaction point, I think, getting it out of proportion and therefore possibly neglecting other strategic threats, that would be my main one for what might have at least gone wrong in some ways or in some places. As I say, I think on the international cooperation side, just continuing to develop that is the key thing for the future. And bear in mind the pandemic hit on the economy and on the ability of member states to contribute to international cooperation. This is something we should worry about. Let's make sure that as resources feel more stretched after the pandemic or in the closing stages of the pandemic, that we don't neglect the fact that we do need this international cooperation to keep us safe from terrorism, but also from other strategic threats that cross national boundaries.
I actually don't think your point on overreaction is all that controversial. I've heard many former counterterrorism officials make the same point. They don't say it publicly very often, but Jane, what are your thoughts on lessons learned, and how do we unwind these huge bureaucracies in the UK and the US that have been built to combat counterterrorism? I mean, terrorism. Sorry.
I think there's a prioritization thing that is driven by money, and to put it crudely, there is money in counterterrorism. Whether that's governmental budgets, whether it's think tanks talking about terrorism. It's a great panel we've gone on right now. There is money in the counterterrorism world, and until the money shifts elsewhere and there is more money, you're more likely to get budgets by focusing on hostile state activity or supporting democracy, human rights, that sort of thing. As ever, it's follow the money. A point also made, I think, by one of the Q&As on illicit finances, and can we do more to target terrorists with illicit finance flows, which I think the answer is yes. That is one of those things that is happening, and more weight could be put in that. I think the biggest thing we got wrong is also one of the things that we now get right, and it's around human rights. And I don't think that's an area that we got right, getting human rights as an important part of the focus in the early days of counterterrorism operations. Certainly from a UK perspective, it has for some time been front and centre of what we do. And sometimes as someone on the inside, you know, I read about the apparent sort of lackadaisical way in which governments approach counterterrorism, and then I look at sort of the big piles of paper and assurances and compliance issues that I and my colleagues spend quite a lot of time on to make sure that we actually really do focus on human rights. A, because it's the right thing to do, and B, because if you don't put human rights front and centre of fighting terrorism, it comes back and bites you in the bottom. It's ultimately counterproductive. So I think that's the thing that we got wrong and we now get right, but we live a little bit with the legacy of not getting it right originally.
Indeed. Nadwa, how would you answer these questions?
I think there was success in dismantling al-Qaeda leadership. I think in Yemen that did have an impact, you know, regardless of the unintended consequences. I think the biggest mistake that the West has done, America in particular, is supporting regimes unconditionally just because they said they are committed to counterterrorism. And we know that they were not only that they were not committed to countering terrorism, but they were also employing terrorist groups and keeping that terrorist threat alive so that they can maintain that international legitimacy and keep the money flowing from the West, in particular America. So biggest lessons learned, just because somebody says they want to fight terrorism or they fight terrorism, you know, take that with a large grain of salt and pay attention to propaganda. It is frustrating to me to see articles and analysis by Western analysts that basically rely on Houthi propaganda or some online platform that we don't know where it came from. So pay attention. There is a lot of disinformation out there, and it's meant to shape the mentality of Western policymakers, but also those who influence them. I think also that the important lessons learned is that it's important that we be more proactive and not wait until it happens to react. So in this sense, keep an eye on other groups that are a threat. Don't assume that they're not a threat just because they haven't attacked inside the US yet.
Yeah, good point. And by saying there's been an overreaction and there's too much bureaucracy, I think no one is suggesting, clearly it's been a good thing that governments have figured out over 20 years how to mow the grass, as they put it in the last panel, and deal with this problem. And the intelligence collection is much better than it ever was. And perhaps that's a reason there has been a 9/11 style attack. But what would you say about lessons learned in terms of mistakes made and successes in the counterterrorism fight?
There are two mistakes that no one talked about here. The first mistake is Iraq, and the second mistake is Syria. The first mistake of Iraq, invading, what a absolute catastrophe, that was. It set the entire region 20 years back. And the second mistake was Syria, for not intervening. And I apologize, my room has just been invaded by my daughter, so sorry about that. But all I can say, that Iraq, the invasion was a disaster, and in Syria, the non-intervention was even a bigger disaster. These are the two mistakes and the biggest regrets, I would say, I've seen them unfold before us over the years.
That seems a little contradictory, though. If non-intervention in Syria was a disaster, but intervention in Iraq was a disaster. Unpack that a little bit.
In Iraq, there was no need for intervention. There was no ongoing humanitarian disaster there that necessitated that if we don't go in and we will end up not preventing the deaths of so many people. But in Syria, the lack of intervention, just a minute, small intervention, would have persuaded Assad to actually retreat a little bit and to talk sense, especially in 2012. So, I apologize. I absolutely apologize for this. I tried to hide as much as possible.
We are all living in pandemic times, working at home. My colleague had her kids go on live television not so long ago. So this is nothing compared to that. Let's see, where are we? I think we're at the end of our time. Anybody have any closing thoughts? Points you want to make that haven't been made about the counterterrorism battle? Well, listen, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful discussion. It was a pleasure to hear all your views, and I hope folks out there got a lot out of it, because I certainly did. So thanks very much, guys.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ken.